While going back and watching part one of this little video series, I realized I said analog versus automatic turntables. What I meant to say was manual versus turntables, because I think all turntables are technically analog. So, yeah. Anyway, back to the main video. Ever since the early 1980s, CDs have been a huge part of the music buying and collecting world. There seems to be two main factions when it comes to CDs. You have people who outright just cannot stand CDs, they don't ever want to buy them. And you got people that are like me who just love CDs, and even though, we have records, we'll still buy something even if we have it on record on CD. I have around 120 to 130 CDs, and most of my CDs I already have the same album on vinyl. But I still like having it just as a duplicate, just in case something happens to the record, and I can also listen to it in my car. But also, too, I have CDs of things that I don't have on vinyl. When it comes to CDs, you can just about buy them anywhere, but CD players are an entirely different story. Most of your CD players now, at least your newer ones, they're not really made for stereo units. They're more just one-piece units that come with the built-in speakers and everything else, so you can just plug it up, put in your CD, and play. And there are some nice ones like the Bose CD players, but as you can see, they're really expensive. And to me, if you're trying to put a CD player in a stereo system, they're definitely not worth it, because the big thing with the Bose players is that they come with built-in speakers, and they're nice. I will say they are nice systems, but for a stereo system, I don't know if you'd really want one. And when it comes to vintage stereo CD players, there are a ton of them. There are a ton of vintage Sony and Technics CD players that they look great and they sound great, and their prices are somewhat reasonable. The two main vintage ones that I use are my Sony CDP70, which you see me working on, and it is a tank of a CD player. I love it. And the other one is a Technics SLPG340. This thing, again, is built like a tank. It looks really nice, and just like the Sony CDP70, it sounds fantastic. The other Technics CD player I have is an SLPD8. It's one of the carousel systems that can hold multiple discs at a time, but it's kind of finicky, and I don't really ever use it because of that. And I'm sure if I looked into it, I could figure out what goes on with it. But when you have a 5 interchangeable disc player system, problems probably will arise. But if you want something new, what I'm going to recommend isn't even a CD player, it's actually a DVD player. This Sony DVD player not only plays standard CDs, but it also plays CDRs or burned CDs or whatever you want to call them. Because most of your normal CD players won't play burned CDs for whatever reason, or at least not in my experience, so this right here has a huge advantage over other players. And as of right now, or making this video, these things are only 33 bucks, and that is a steal because these things sound great. The only downside to them is that they're a bit slow when it comes to how fast they operate in terms of pressing buttons or whatever. There is a bit of a delay, but other than that, they work just fine. And these things are really durable too. My dad has had one for around 10 years, and his still works just fine. And I've had mine for around 6 or 7 years, and again, it works just fine as well. Now, CD prices are relatively cheap. New CDs typically range anywhere between 5, 10, 15, or even sometimes 20 bucks, just depending on what comes with it. You can see here the special edition of Revolver is 25 bucks, but as you can see, it comes with a little book. The CD case itself is almost presented like a box set, and it's a double CD album. In used CDs, you can typically get it for around $1 to $10, depending on the rarity. This CD, for example, this Jesus Lizard one, it is a first pressing of that album, and for $7.99, that's not bad at all. And this kind of brings me to my next point, and that is you can typically get rare records on CD for a much cheaper price. And I'll give you a great example of this. This double single 7-inch is a partnership between Nirvana and the Jesus Lizard. As you can see, it's around $100, and that is the current going price of these because they haven't been repressed since then. But the CD of this double single record is much cheaper, and it was made the exact same year as the record. But CDs typically get more pressings than records, especially in the 90s when this came out, so of course it's going to be cheaper. And even though this is a $20 CD, that's still a really good deal because this is a more rare item. And that's the great thing about CDs is even rare items are much cheaper than the record version. The most I've ever spent on a CD was $30, and it was Sam Hain's last album, Final Descent. picture you're seeing I actually took while making this video. So if you're a fan of Sam Hain and don't have this album, I was just picking it up because $30 for a first pressing of a Sam Hain CD is a steal. And there is an unofficial pressing going around right now for around 35 to 38 bucks, which is a great deal for a Sam Hain record, unofficial or not. But still, you can get an original on CD for less. Preferably, I would just get both, but that's just me. But there's a question I've been avoiding until now, which is which one sounds better, records or CDs? And the answer is neither. I mean, I'm going to be completely honest. Can you tell there's a difference? Yes. Records tend to have a bit more of a warmth, as where CDs have a bit more of a preciseness when it comes to sound. And sometimes there are pressings on record that sound awful, and you can find a variant of that same album on CD and it sounds way better, and vice versa. It just depends, really. And I know I've been talking a lot about pressings and stuff. I'll get into that later. That's not that big of a problem right now. But I just wanted to bring it up here because it is kind of a factor when it comes to quality of sound. Sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes. And again, unless you have like superhuman hearing, it's not going to be that drastic of a difference. And also, too, you have to have like thousands upon thousands of dollars in stereo equipment to notice that drastic of a difference. And most of us aren't going to be in that situation. But at that point, you've strayed so far from this wanting to listen to the album that does it even really matter anymore what it sounds like? But I digress. CDs are great. At the end of the day, CD players can be found readily available. CDs themselves can be found readily available, and I would highly recommend getting into them. And let's get into the last main platform that I wanted to discuss. Cassettes are like the weird middle child that people try to ignore, but they're still there. And surprisingly, they've made quite a comeback in the last 4 or 5 years. A part of me still thinks that they came back because of Star-Lord's use of cassettes in the Guardians of the Galaxy films, but that's just me. And also, there have been waves of kind of this retro hipster vibe going on for the past few years too, and cassettes just happened to get caught up in it. But cassette players didn't really get caught up in that whole nostalgia wave. At least, not the good ones. With all physical music platforms, you have WoW and Flutter, but this especially comes into play with cassettes, at least from my experience. And all WoW and Flutter really are just fluctuations in play speed, WoW being slow and Flutter being fast. And if those two are off, your cassette's going to sound awful. Now, a lot of these newer cassette decks, like this Pile one, they're actually made of really cheap parts, and therefore the WoW and Flutter is going to be really bad. And for $170 to get something that sounds really bad is just ridiculous. And there are some newer cassette players out there, but again, if they're made of cheap components, the WoW and Flutter are going to be, well, probably really bad. And there are some higher quality cassette decks being made, but $500 for a cassette deck in 2025 is ridiculous when you can get a nice turntable and CD player for under $200. And I want to show y'all one of these mechanisms because they're kind of complex, but you can break them down into 3 or 4 simple little parts, at least from a listening standpoint. You have your reels, you have your play and record head, and then you have the pinch roller. This model actually has an erase head, but not all cassette decks are going to have an erase head. And just to give you a bit more of a complex diagram, Steve from Steve's Electronic Repair Shop actually made a video kind of breaking down how cassette decks work and how to repair them. And let me tell you, it is a complex system. And to give you a little example, I have this Sony TCW5. It is my main cassette deck, and this thing is great. But when I got it, the B deck was not working. And I had to do a lot of work. I had to reposition the opening and closing of the doors. I had to reposition the pinch roller, and I had to reposition some levers on the inside that somehow came loose when I was fixing it. I mean, it was a big mess, and it was easy to fix once I figured everything out, but still, there was a lot going on. And that's because these are just very hands-on mechanical machines that eventually you're going to have to replace parts or open it up and make sure that something, if it came loose, to put it back. I mean, it's a bit of a process, but it isn't like just, oh my God, this is so bad I can't do it. Because this actually gives you practice and experience in repairing your own equipment, which is something you might have to do later on down the line. I mean, I've had to repair the CD players, cassette decks, All the Techniques players that I've got, I had to open up and make sure that they were all fully functioning again because they hadn't been used in like 20 years. So, I mean, it's all about learning how your stuff works, and especially with cassette decks. Most of your work from cassette decks actually comes from the belts. So cassette decks are actually belt driven, and sometimes the belts they give because they just get spun around too many times, this age, whatever the case may be. Eventually that belt's going to give, and when it does, you're going to have to replace it. And some belts are easy to get to and replace, and there are others, like this other image of a cassette deck, to where it's nearly impossible to get to without desoldering things or whatever else. And the reason I keep mentioning all this mechanical stuff and replacement stuff and all this maintenance is because I'm going to recommend that if you want to get into cassettes, that you get a vintage cassette player. There are tons of these things on eBay, and most of them are tested and working, or some are been refurbished, and most of them you can find the replacement parts yourself in case the belts are bad or whatever else. And the brand I would recommend is Sony. And the only reason I'm recommending Sony is because that's what I know and that's what I'm comfortable with. But if there's another brand that you want to look at, I would definitely look into it and make sure you find not only the best one, but the one that is the most reasonably priced. Now, there are also a bunch of broken cassette decks on eBay as well. And if you're not experienced with working on your own stuff, then I wouldn't recommend getting one that's broken. And even if you are experienced with working on your own stuff, I wouldn't necessarily just jump to getting a 4 parts cassette deck because it might just be the belt. It might just be a piece got loose. But then again, it could also not be that. And so then you're stuck with a pile of junk that you can't return and can't use. And there are a lot of videos on YouTube of people that are well more experienced than I am when it comes to cassette decks. They're making a bunch of guides and tutorials and everything else, and I'd highly recommend watching those too before you make your final decision, unless you're just like me and knew what you were looking for from the get-go. Now, there are different versions of cassettes. There's like types 1 through 4. Heck, I even know there's such a thing as metal cassettes, but I'm going to be so honest. If you're not into the recording aspect of cassettes, I don't really know how much of that's going to be relevant to you. I mean, I can tell you right now, as someone who's been buying cassettes and buying music, I've only ran across like just normal old albums on cassette, and that's really all I'm into. But you might be more into the other aspects of it. So there, I would recommend you go find other people who know way more about that subject than I do. Now, if you're in the music collecting, I mean, cassettes, there are a lot of good albums on cassette right now that are new, and they're priced really well. If you look at the price, they're all around $10 to $11 outside of like maybe 1 or 2 of these. But even then, they're still around the price of the CD, and sometimes they're even less, and they're especially less than the actual record. And that's really cool because cassettes almost, in a weird way, are kind of like those odd collectibles or collector's items. But to see them for such a reasonable price, it's just, I don't know, it's awesome. Now, used cassettes is kind of a different ballpark. A lot of them are cheap, but the more known albums, especially if they're first releases of the album on cassette, they're going to be expensive, and that's just how it is. The most I've ever paid for a cassette was $27, and it was a November Coming Fire cassette, and it's an original one from 1986. And that might sound like a lot of money for a cassette tape, but trust me, these things can go for a whole lot more. Now, some people bring up that cassette tapes will actually break over time, but is that really true? And the answer is yes, but it's because of how people use them. My dad is a giant music junkie just like I am, which is where I get it from. But still, he had a ton of cassette tapes back in the day, and he said him and his friends used them so much that they just eventually began to warp and break. But if you don't overuse a cassette tape, just play it once and put it up for a little bit, or make sure you're not running it in like a car system, it's not going to break unless just something bad happens. I mean, I have several cassettes myself, and outside of one being damaged and that's why it broke, I've never had one warp to where I couldn't play it anymore. Or warp at all for that matter. And the sound quality of cassettes are good too. I mean, as long as you keep your system clean, because you will have to every once in a while clean the inside of the cassette deck itself. But outside of that, I mean, it's fine. I mean, if you ever are interested in them, I definitely look into it because I love them, even though I don't have that many. But I definitely plan on picking up more in the future, even if it's an album I already own on a different platform. An amplifier or receiver is a big part of your stereo system, especially if you're running multiple units or older units that don't have any built-in preamp. Now, if your turntable already has a built-in preamp and all your other machines have RCA inputs and you don't really feel like using a receiver or an amplifier, you can just get one of these. These RCA switchers are really nice and they don't require any power. You just plug in your systems, select the switch, and let it ride. I have a couple of these and they work just fine. But if you need preamp or your speakers need an amplifier or receiver to work, well, you have a bunch of different options. Amplifiers and receivers are about the exact same thing, but a receiver has a tuner input, which is the radio. And these tuners are built right into the receiver, as where an amplifier can still have a tuner with it, but it's a separate model instead of just built in. And there are a bunch of new receivers being made now, but for my money, I would probably get this Sony one. It can sometimes go on sale for around $50 to even $100 I've seen before, so I'd definitely look into that if you want a stereo receiver. And amplifiers are typically a little bit cheaper. Now, I wouldn't get something as cheap as this Powell system because these systems are just not that good, but you have different options. Fozy or Fozzy stereo amplifiers seem to be pretty nice. They typically range from around $70 to $100, and you can sometimes find them on sale for around $50. There are also tube amplifiers. These tend to have a warmer tone to them. They also look really cool, but prices vary, and typically they lean more on the expensive side. And there are literally tons of vintage receivers and amps. And the prices vary down to like $20 to if you want one of those really rare, expensive ones, around like $1,000 and up. So just look around and see what's out there. But make sure if you get a vintage amp or receiver that the seller has a return policy. I say this because I was put in that situation one time. I ordered a receiver and it worked, but then it had some weird like power circuit overload thing to where it kept going in like intervals of clicking and spazzing out. And I had to eventually return it because there was no way I could fix it. And fortunately, the seller had a return policy. In my system, I have a Sony TA-AX520 amplifier, and I love this thing. It's built like a tank, and it has all the inputs that I would need. This is the amplifier which originally came with the system, which means it has the Control S ports. And that's all I have to say about amps and receivers. Make sure you can get a model that works with all your other parts, and if it's vintage, make sure that you have a return policy with it, just in case something goes wrong. But don't forget these little RCA switchers. These are great amplifier or receiver substitutes, especially if you don't need preamp or have independent speakers. And now that I got the CD player working, I put it into the system, and here it all is. I even put in my old Sony DVD player that I had as a kid. Also made this little temporary stereo cabinet for it, just to give some of this stuff breathing room. Now all that was left was to hook up my old speakers and my new speakers. I ordered these Edifier P12 speakers because they were passive, meaning that they would run off of the amplifier, and I just wanted something like that for my stereo system because my other speakers are independent, meaning that they have their own power and they have their own control knobs for tone, bass, and volume. But something weird happened when I plugged in the speakers. When I cut up the volume, it began making this weird noise and spazzing out. I should have figured it wasn't going to be that easy. But anyway, on to the last main topic. Speakers are the most important part of a stereo system. Without them, you can't even hear the music. Now, there are all types of speakers you can get out there for your stereo system, both new and old. And the price of speakers, both new and vintage, ranges anywhere between, I would say, around $100 to $300 and up. And there are speakers that cost a whole lot more than that, but that's the only range I'm going to try to stick to. But I'm going to go ahead and say that I'm not going to really talk about vintage speakers. It's not that I don't care about them, it's just that I don't really know that much about them. All my speakers are new, and I haven't really dealt with any vintage speakers. And I don't want to mislead you by giving you false information about me that's trying to pretend like I know anything about vintage speakers. And then you end up getting vintage speakers that suck. And you're like, well, your video said to get them. So I'm just going to stay completely out of that. So when it comes to speakers, you have passive or dependent speakers and independent speakers. And what that really means is that the speakers are powered by the amplifier or receiver. The ones I'm unboxing, which I'm showing you right now on the screen, they don't have their own independent power source. They are solely powered by plugging them into my amp. Now, my other speakers, which are the Edifier R1700s, they have their own independent power source, and they also have their own independent control knobs, including power, bass, and I believe treble. The big thing you have to worry about when it comes to speakers is if it can work with your amplifier if you have one. The biggie is impedance. And the best way I can explain this is that the ohms from your speakers have to match up with the ohms from your amplifier or receiver, or else you're going to get that clicking and spazzing out noise that I showed you earlier. And that's why these speakers didn't work, because they have an impedance level of 6 ohms, and my amplifier's impedance level is at 8 ohms. But most of your modern equipment should run together. I just had a problem because mine was older running with newer, so I had to find newer speakers that would work with the older equipment. And that's just one of those things you run into when you mix new and old equipment. And take what I say with a grain of salt, but from what I've seen, most of your modern stereo equipment runs around 6 ohms of impedance levels, and your amplifiers and receivers can kind of carry a range of that stuff. So I wouldn't say be overly cautious, but just make sure, or else you'll be in my situation where you have to send the old speakers back to get new ones. Now I'm going to recommend the Edifier and Clip speakers that I've already shown you. These speakers sound fantastic, and the Edifier ones I've had now for, I don't know, nearly 7-8 years, and they still work just fine. And Edifier makes an even more affordable version of the R1700s, and these sound pretty good too. I wouldn't say they're on the same level as the R1700s, but if they're in a smaller bedroom or something, or even in a living room, they sound pretty nice. And from what little I heard of the P12s, they actually sounded really good. So just do your research on what type of speakers you want, make sure you have the right impedance levels, and you should be all set. And that's the end of part 2. Like I said in the previous video, I can only make these a half hour long, and the next subjects I want to talk about cannot fit within the last few minutes of this video, so I'm just going to have to make a separate video entirely. And I'm working on part 2 right now anyways, so it should be out within the next few days, just like I had this one out within the next few days of the last video. But until then, just stay tuned, and I'll see you around.